So in Lab 10 this semester, you're going to be exploring genetics and using probabilities and chi-squares in order to kind of confirm or deny if these genetics are following the rules that we think they should. So there are, 9 experiments in this lab where you're going to be counting lots of things and then doing a good amount of math. So the chi-squares are going to be a big part of this, but your collection of data and understanding that data will also be a pretty big part of this. So we've got 2 examples of the things you're going to be counting during this lab. Corn, plastic corn, real plastic corn that may or may not have been eaten by mice in Lake County, because apparently the mice in Lake County really just like plastic corn. Come on, I don't understand, right?
Totally smart.
It's all good. I laugh every time. Like, this was totally eaten by a mouse. Anyway, so you are going to be counting what you can see. Obviously, you cannot count the things that have disappeared, right? So there's a few in here that are totally just missing. So these are, again, 2 examples of the corn that we're going to be looking at. So procedure 10.7 is looking at a monohybrid cross, which means you are only looking at one thing, right? Because mono means one. So you are looking just at the black kernels versus the yellow kernels, or mostly yellow because students have been writing on them for years. Yeah. So the black kernels are outnumbering the yellow kernels, right? You can see that just by looking at it. Now, the expected ratio from a monohybrid cross like this is that we would get a 3-to-1 ratio, meaning that there would be 3 black kernels to every 1 yellow kernel. And that is figured out with Punnett squares and the probability, which is something we can discuss later. But from looking at this, you are going to be counting. Right, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the blacks, all right, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the yellows, and you will end up with a X amount of observed corn kernels. You will then take your observed total and figure out what your expected value should be, right? So you can't figure out your expected value without your observed value, right? What you actually counted.
Right, and that's why we don't worry too much about ones that you can't count, because your expected will be based off of what you observe. So don't worry too much about those.
So then your expected values will be taken from that 3-to-1 ratio, because that's what we are expecting to happen. That's basically our hypothesis. We hypothesize that there's a 3-to-1 ratio. And then you do the chi-square value in order to help us to decide if we can support or falsify that hypothesis. So now 10.9 is a little bit more complicated, because this is an example of what's called a dihybrid cross, which means we are looking at 2 things. You are looking at both the color and what we consider the texture, right? So the color is still black and yellow, right? And you can still notice, I think pretty clearly, that the blacks outnumber the yellows, but we are also looking at texture, right? So there are smooth corn kernels and there are textured or wrinkled, is that what we call them? Wrinkled kernels.
Like a raisin.
It looks a lot like a raisin. So you can kind of notice here, I think one of the things that my students often get confused by is that there's a little indentation in the ones that are considered smooth.
Divot.
Yeah, the little divot there, and that is still smooth. A lot of students will count that as wrinkled, and it kind of makes our data look a little funny. So there is a pretty good difference between the raisin looking ones and the smooth ones, both for the black and the yellow. So you are going to go through and count all of the black smooth, the black wrinkled, the yellow smooth, and the yellow wrinkled. Now, because there are 4 options here, you have a slightly different expectation here, right? Our expected ratio, it can't just be 2 numbers. It actually has to be 4. And this is where things get a little interesting. All right, so there are 16 possible combinations here, which means our ratio is actually 4 possible combinations, but there are 16 outcomes. There we go. So there is a ratio of 9 to 3 to 3 to 1. So if you actually look at this Punnett square in your, say our textbook has it, you can see it pretty clearly of how this ends up happening. So 9 of these are going to be black and smooth out of 16 that you count. 3 will be yellow and smooth out of the 16 that you count. 3 will be black and wrinkled out of those 16 for every 16 you count. And then there's 1 out of those 16 that is the yellow wrinkled seed. So again, if you do this big old Punnett square, you can see how this will happen. And that is, again, our expected value. So you'll count them. Then you'll compare them to our expected value using your total observed value in order to crank out that calculated chi-square value. Yes?
Yes. So just to repeat, you would go through, you count all the smooth black, the wrinkled black, the smooth yellow, the wrinkled yellow. That is your observed data for those 4 potential outcomes. Based on your total number, we expect the ratio to be a 9 to 3 to 3 to 1 ratio. So once we have our observed total, we will be able to calculate our expected values for black smooth, black wrinkled, yellow wrinkled. Then we'll be able to make a comparison using the chi-square test to see how much the data has deviated. Is it deviating within what we consider our acceptable range, or is it outside that deviation? Based on that, you will be able to either say that you supported your hypothesis or that your data caused you to have to reject your hypothesis. It failed to support it.
Fails. One of the other things we can talk here really quickly is about dominant versus recessive, because really what this is showing us is what traits are dominant and which are recessive. So your black smooth have 2 dominant characteristics or traits. The yellow smooth have 1 dominant and 1 recessive. The black smooth will have 1 dominant and 1 recessive, and then the cute little yellow wrinkles down here are going to be the ones that have both recessive traits. So that's something else we could explore later.
Exactly.